Friends, thank you for being here today. I want to ask you something that sounds simple, but the answer will fundamentally change the way you see your home, your bank, and your financial future. What if the most important number in your life right now is not your salary, not your savings account, not even your retirement fund, but the date printed on your mortgage renewal notice? Because right now, across Canada, that date is becoming a time bomb, and most people have absolutely no idea it has already started ticking. Here is the paradox that I need you to sit with for a moment. Canada did not have a housing crash in 2008 when the rest of the developed world was watching its financial edifice crumble into rubble. Canada was celebrated. Canada was the model. Its banks were disciplined. Its regulators were prudent. Its homeowners, we were told, were responsible. And for 15 years, that narrative held. Home prices climbed. Household wealth soared. An entire generation of Canadians watched their net worth double, triple, quadruple, not because they built a business, not because they invented something, not because they outworked the competition, but simply because they owned the right piece of real estate at the right moment in history. That era is over, and what is replacing it is something that has no playbook, no historical precedent in this country, and no comfortable resolution. Let me give you a number that I want you to genuinely feel, not just hear. Canadian household debt has now surpassed 170% of disposable income. 170%. That is not a statistic from a struggling economy. That is not a number from a country in the middle of a war or a famine or a political collapse. That is the financial architecture of a nation that convinced itself that paper wealth and borrowed prosperity were the same thing as real, tangible security. They are not. And the mechanism that is about to expose that illusion is hiding in plain sight inside every single mortgage contract that is coming up for renewal between now and 2027. This is not a market correction. This is not a temporary adjustment. What we are watching unfold is a structural fault line baked into the very foundation of Canada's consumer economy that has been building for 2 decades and is now beginning to crack under the weight of its own design. And when this fault line fully opens, it will not just affect homeowners, it will ripple through retail, through employment, through the balance sheets of the 5 most powerful banks in the country, and ultimately through the pockets of every single Canadian, whether they own property or not. Now, I want you to understand something crucial before we go any further, because without this context, the danger of what I am about to show you simply does not compute. This crisis did not begin in 2022 when the Bank of Canada started raising interest rates. It did not begin in 2020 when the pandemic unleashed the most aggressive monetary stimulus in the country's history. To truly understand what is happening, we have to go back further. We have to go back to the very architecture of how central banks and mortgage markets operate, because the roots of this particular crisis are buried deep in the design of the system itself. Think about what a mortgage actually is at its most fundamental level. It is a promise that you make to a bank in exchange for money today, that you will pay back that money plus interest over a defined period of time. In Canada, that period is typically amortized over 25 years. But here is the critical detail that most Canadians never truly internalize. The interest rate on that promise is not fixed for the full 25 years. It is fixed for a term, typically 5 years, sometimes 3, sometimes 1, and then it resets. During the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021, the Bank of Canada slashed its policy rate to 0.25%, 0.25, essentially zero. And when the policy rate is essentially zero, mortgage rates follow. Fixed 5-year mortgage rates fell to levels that, historically speaking, were incomprehensible. 1%, 1.5%, 2%. Canadians who bought homes or refinanced during that window locked in those rates. And for 5 years, everything felt fine. Monthly payments were manageable. Real estate values kept climbing. The illusion of prosperity was, for a time, indistinguishable from prosperity itself. Then the Bank of Canada did something it was designed to do. It responded to inflation by raising rates, and it did not raise them gently. In roughly 18 months, one of the most aggressive monetary tightening cycles in Canadian financial history, the policy rate went from that 0.25% all the way past 5%. Think about what that means in practical terms. Think about the simple logic of a household that bought a home at 2% interest. Their monthly payment was calibrated to that number. Their budget was built around that number. Their sense of financial stability was anchored to that number. And now, when that 5-year term ends, they walk into their bank and discover that the world has changed entirely. The new rate is not 2%. It is 5.5%. It is 6%. For some, it is higher. And overnight, not metaphorically, but literally overnight, their mortgage payment has increased by hundreds of dollars per month. In many cases, more than $1,000 per month. This is what I call the mortgage renewal shock. And this is the system's most crucial structural threat, which we will explore in full detail in just a moment. But first, I need you to understand something about the timeline, because this is where the true horror of the situation reveals itself. Mortgage renewals do not all happen at once. They cluster. They come in waves. And the wave that is about to crash onto the Canadian shoreline is the largest, most concentrated, most financially consequential renewal wave this country has ever faced. The majority of those mortgages written at pandemic-era rates, at 1%, at 1.5%, at 2%, are renewing between 2025 and 2027. We are at the beginning of that window right now. This is not a future problem. This is not something to monitor from a safe distance. It has already begun. And this is where I need you to stop thinking about this as an abstract economic event happening to some nameless, faceless category of borrowers. Because the numbers that are about to follow are not hypothetical projections from a think tank. They are the mathematical consequences of contracts that have already been signed, at rates that have already been set, with renewal dates that are already printed on documents sitting in filing cabinets and inbox folders across this country right now. Let us talk about what this actually looks like at the kitchen table level, because that is where this crisis lives, not in a boardroom, not in a trading floor, at the kitchen table of a family in Mississauga or Calgary or Halifax who bought a home in 2020 because rates were low and because every authority they trusted, their bank, their real estate agent, the financial media, told them that this was the responsible thing to do. They took out a mortgage at 1.79% on a home that cost them, let us say, $700,000. Their monthly payment was manageable, tight perhaps, but manageable. They built a life around it. 2 incomes, maybe a child or 2, a car payment, the ordinary architecture of a modern Canadian household. Now that renewal notice arrives, and the number printed on it is not 1.79, it is 5.64. Their monthly payment does not nudge upward. It does not drift slightly higher. It vaporizes their margin. What was once manageable becomes, overnight, a financial emergency. And they are not alone. There are not thousands of these households. There are hundreds of thousands. And when hundreds of thousands of households simultaneously have their discretionary spending capacity wiped out by a single mortgage renewal event, what you get is not a housing problem. What you get is a consumer economy problem. And Canada's consumer spending drives a significant portion of its entire GDP. This is the contagion mechanism. This is how the fault line spreads. Now let me show you the canary in the coal mine, because it is already singing. Watch what is happening to retail sales data across Canada. Watch what is happening to furniture stores, to appliance retailers, to renovation companies. These sectors are not suffering because Canadians have lost the desire to improve their homes or furnish their lives. They are suffering because the household cash flow that once funded those purchases is now being rerouted every single month directly into the pockets of the banks in the form of higher mortgage payments. The money that used to go to IKEA or Home Depot or the local contractor is now going to service debt. That is a direct mechanical transfer of spending power away from the real economy and into the financial system. And it is happening right now, vanishing in real time in the bank accounts of middle-class Canadians from coast to coast. But I want to go deeper than consumer spending because there is another layer to this crisis that almost nobody in the mainstream financial conversation is talking about. And this is the part that I think will genuinely shock you. It has to do with what Canada's banks are actually holding on their balance sheets and what happens to those balance sheets when the mortgage stress begins to spread. Canada's 5 major banks, Royal Bank, TD, Bank of Montreal, CIBC, and Scotiabank, hold mortgage portfolios that are, by any measure, staggering in their scale. Mortgages have historically been treated as the safest possible asset class in Canadian banking. A Canadian homeowner, the conventional wisdom went, would stop paying for virtually everything else before they stopped paying their mortgage. They would cancel vacations, skip vehicle payments, run up credit cards, but the mortgage would be the last thing to go because the home is not just a financial asset. It is the place where the family lives. It carries emotional weight that pure financial logic cannot capture. And for decades, that conventional wisdom was correct. Canadian mortgage default rates were extraordinarily low by global standards. The banks built their risk models around it. The regulators built their stress tests around it. The entire financial architecture of the country rested on the bedrock assumption that Canadian mortgages were safe, that they would be paid, always, without exception. Here is what that assumption does not account for. It does not account for a scenario in which the rate reset is so severe, so sudden, and so widespread that it hits hundreds of thousands of households simultaneously, all at once, within the same 2-year window, because when the payment shock is gradual, when it bleeds in slowly over time, affecting a handful of borrowers here, a pocket of borrowers there, the system has time to absorb it. Banks can manage isolated stress. What the system has never been tested against, what no one in Canadian banking history has had to navigate, is a synchronized, concentrated mass renewal event at a moment when rates have risen this far, this fast, from a baseline this low, and here is the forensic evidence that the stress is already materializing. Watch the mortgage arrears data, watch the credit card delinquency numbers that are quietly climbing, watch the personal insolvency filings, which have been trending upward in ways that the financial press has largely underreported. These are not dramatic headline events. They do not explode onto the front page. They accumulate, they compound, they build quietly, month by month, household by household, until the aggregate weight of them becomes impossible to ignore. This is precisely what happened in the United States in 2006 and 2007. The subprime mortgage crisis did not announce itself with a single catastrophic event. It revealed itself in the arrears data first, then in the default rates, then in the write-downs, and only then, long after the damage was already structurally embedded in the system, did the wider world suddenly wake up to the scale of what had been building in plain sight. The canaries were singing the entire time. Almost nobody was listening. I want to be precise here because I am not suggesting that Canada is heading for an American-style subprime catastrophe. The Canadian mortgage market has meaningful structural differences, stress tests, tighter underwriting standards, full recourse lending in most provinces that provide genuine buffers, but buffers are not immunity. And I want you to understand what no escape looks like when the pressures converge all at once. Your housing wealth, it is built on leverage, and leverage cuts in both directions. When prices were rising and rates were falling, leverage was a miracle machine. It multiplied your gains. It made you feel wealthy. It gave you the illusion that you had built something real. But now rates have risen, and in many Canadian markets, prices have softened from their peak. The miracle machine is running in reverse. Your paper equity, the number that made you feel secure, the number you referenced at dinner parties, the number your bank used to extend you a home equity line of credit, is contracting quietly, slowly, but contracting. Your savings, inflation, even at its current moderated levels, is still eroding the purchasing power of every dollar sitting in a savings account that earns less than the inflation rate. You are not breaking even. You are losing ground. Slowly, invisibly, month by month, the real value of your cash savings is evaporating. Your employment? Housing-related sectors account for a significant share of Canadian employment. Construction workers, real estate agents, mortgage brokers, renovation contractors, furniture retailers, appliance dealers, all of these jobs are tied, directly or indirectly, to the health of the housing market. When housing activity slows, that employment base contracts. And when that employment base contracts, you have another layer of household income pressure layered on top of the mortgage renewal shock that is already compressing consumer spending. Do you begin to see the architecture of the problem? It is not one thing. It was never going to be one thing. The liquidity tide is going out, and we are about to find out at a national scale who has been swimming naked in Canada's housing boom. And there is one more dimension to this that I have not yet addressed, one that operates above the household level, above the banking sector level, and reaches all the way into the structural fiscal position of the Canadian government itself. Because when mortgage stress spreads, when consumer spending contracts, when housing-related employment falls, the government's tax revenues fall with them. And at the same moment that revenues are contracting, the demand for social support programs expands. This is the sovereign dimension of a housing debt shock. and it is a dimension that is already begun, already visible in the budget projections of provinces like Ontario and British Columbia, where housing-dependent tax revenues have become a structural pillar of fiscal planning, a pillar that is now being quietly, incrementally undermined. This is what a convergence looks like, not a single explosion, a series of interconnected fault lines, each one stressing the next, each one making the next harder to contain. A synchronized mortgage renewal shock hitting hundreds of thousands of households, a consumer economy losing its spending engine, a banking sector facing rising arrears against portfolios it built on the assumption of permanent safety, a government facing fiscal pressure at the precise moment its revenue base is softening. 4 fault lines, one window, 2025 to 2027. The scaffolding is under strain, friends, and the critical question, the only question that matters now, is what you are going to do about it before the window closes. Now I want to stop talking about the system for a moment, and I want to talk about you. Specifically, I want to talk about the single greatest threat to your financial survival in the years ahead. And it is not the Bank of Canada. It is not the mortgage renewal wave. It is not the banks or the government or the bond market. It is something far more intimate, far more insidious, and far harder to defend against because it lives inside your own mind. It is called normalcy bias, and it is the psychological architecture that is right now preventing the majority of Canadians from acting on what is plainly visible in front of them. Human beings are hardwired to believe that tomorrow will look like yesterday. It is not a character flaw. It is not stupidity. It is evolutionary programming designed over hundreds of thousands of years to help us navigate a world where most days were in fact roughly similar to the days that preceded them. The sun rose, the sun set, the seasons changed, the tribe survived. Our brains learn to extrapolate from recent experience because, for the vast majority of human history, recent experience was a reliable guide to the near future. But that programming becomes catastrophically dangerous at precisely the moments in history when the underlying system undergoes a structural break, when the thing that has been true for the last decade is no longer true, when the rules quietly change while the majority of people are still playing by the old ones. And the tragedy, the genuine heartbreaking tragedy, is that normalcy bias is strongest exactly when the danger is greatest. When the evidence of structural change is accumulating right in front of us, the psychological immune system kicks in and whispers, "This will pass. Things always recover. Canada is different. The banks will figure it out. The government will step in. It always works out." That whisper has bankrupted more people than any market crash in history, not because the crash was unpredictable, but because the whisper was more comfortable than the evidence. Let me give you the other psychological trap that is working against you right now, and it is one that is particularly devastating in a country like Canada, where real estate has been the dominant wealth creation mechanism for an entire generation. It is called the money illusion, and it operates like this. You bought a home a decade ago for $400,000. Today, even after the modest price corrections in many markets, that home might be worth $800,000. You feel wealthy, you feel secure, you feel in the most visceral and deeply human sense like you have made it, like you have built something, like you are a millionaire. But here is the brutal arithmetic that the money illusion conceals from you. If that $800,000 home requires $600,000 of outstanding mortgage debt to maintain, and that debt is about to be repriced at a rate that increases your monthly obligation by $1,500, and the real purchasing power of your equity has been quietly eroded by years of inflation that the official statistics systematically understate, then what you actually have is not $1 million of security. What you have is a leveraged position in a single illiquid asset, denominated in a currency that is being inflated, serviced by debt that is becoming more expensive, in a market where transaction costs alone will consume a significant portion of your nominal gain the moment you try to convert that paper number into actual spendable wealth. You become a millionaire on paper, but poorer at the grocery store, poorer at the gas pump, poorer every single month as the mortgage renewal absorbs the cash flow that once gave your household room to breathe. This is the money illusion, and right now it is the most dangerous idea in Canadian personal finance. So let us talk about the binary choice that I believe every Canadian with meaningful assets needs to confront directly, honestly, and without the comfortable fog of normalcy bias clouding their judgment. Because at its most fundamental level, the question of financial survival in the years ahead comes down to a single distinction, a distinction that sounds simple but carries consequences that will define the next decade of your financial life. Do you own assets or do you own claims on assets? Think carefully about what that means. A stock is not a business, it is a claim on a business, a claim whose value can be suspended, diluted, manipulated, or vaporized by forces entirely outside your control. An ETF is not a portfolio of real things. It is a claim on a portfolio, a financial instrument whose underlying value depends on the continued functioning of markets, custodians, clearing houses, and regulatory frameworks that most investors have never examined and could not explain. Even the equity in your home, as we have just discussed, is not a fixed, tangible number. It is a claim on a market valuation, a number that exists only as long as someone else is willing to pay it in a credit environment that makes that payment possible. This is not a conspiracy. It is a stated reality of how modern financial systems are constructed. And understanding it is not pessimism. It is the foundation of intelligent preparation. The assets that have survived every currency debasement, every sovereign debt crisis, every banking collapse, every inflationary spiral in recorded human history are not the ones that exist as entries in a database. They are the ones that exist in physical reality: gold, silver, land with productive capacity, hard assets whose value is intrinsic, not assigned by a committee, not dependent on a counterparty, not contingent on the solvency of a financial institution that you have never met and cannot audit. Now, I want to be precise about what I am advocating, because I think precision matters enormously here, and vagueness is the enemy of action. I am not telling you to sell everything and bury gold bars in your backyard. I am not predicting a Mad Max scenario in which the financial system dissolves overnight into chaos, and the only currency that matters is ammunition and canned goods. That is not the argument. The argument is more subtle and more important than that. What I am saying is this: in an environment where the purchasing power of currency is being systematically eroded by monetary expansion, where household debt is being repriced at structurally higher rates, where the consumer economy is facing a demand shock driven by mortgage renewals, where government fiscal positions are being quietly undermined by falling housing-related tax revenues, and where the banking sector's mortgage portfolios face arrears pressure that the risk models were never truly designed to absorb. In that environment, the allocation question is not whether to hold some of your wealth in assets that exist outside the financial system's claims structure. The question is how much and in what form. Gold is not an investment in the conventional sense. Gold does not pay a dividend. It does not generate earnings. It does not compound. What gold does, what it has done for 5,000 years across every civilization that has ever existed, is hold its purchasing power through exactly the kind of structural monetary disorder that we are now navigating. When the Bank of Canada was printing money at an extraordinary pace in 2020 and 2021, gold holders were not generating yield. They were stepping out of the line of fire. And when the consequences of that monetary expansion began to materialize in inflation, in rate hikes, in the mortgage renewal shock that is now unfolding, those who had stepped out of the line of fire found themselves with options, with flexibility, with the capacity to act while others were frozen by the weight of decisions they could no longer reverse. Silver carries the same principle, with the added dimension of industrial demand that gives it a dual characteristic, part monetary metal, part critical industrial input for the technologies that the global economy is betting its future on. When you hold silver, you are not just holding a hedge against monetary disorder, you are holding a real physical commodity that the world's manufacturing base requires in quantities that current supply chains are struggling to meet. And land, productive land, farmland, land with water, land with timber, represents the most ancient form of real wealth that human civilization has ever recognized, not because it is romantic or nostalgic, but because it produces things that human beings need regardless of what the monetary system is doing, regardless of what interest rates are, regardless of what a bank's balance sheet says. The land produces, and what produces has value that no central bank decision can permanently erase. Now, here is what I want you to walk away from this conversation understanding, because I think it is the most important thing I can leave you with. The window for thoughtful, deliberate preparation is not permanently open. It never is. In every financial transition, in every moment when a structural break in the old system creates both danger and opportunity simultaneously, there is a period, always finite, always underestimated in its brevity, when the prepared can act, while the unprepared are still insisting that the old rules still apply. That window is open right now. The mortgage renewal wave is in its early stages. The consumer spending contraction is visible, but not yet acute. The banking sector stress is building, but not yet systemic. The fiscal pressure on provincial and federal balance sheets is growing, but not yet in crisis. This is the moment that history will look back on and identify as the point when the outcome was still in the hands of the individual. When the choices made at kitchen tables and in financial planners' offices and in quiet conversations between partners who finally decided to look clearly at what the numbers were telling them, when those choices still had the power to determine which side of this transition a family landed on. What I call the big secret of the entire system, the thing that the mainstream financial conversation consistently fails to tell you, is that monetary systems do not collapse suddenly. They unwind, they erode, they restructure, and the restructuring always redistributes wealth away from those who held claims on assets and toward those who held the assets themselves. This is not speculation. This is the lesson of every monetary transition in the historical record, from Weimar Germany to 1970s America to the emerging market currency crises of the 1990s to the slow motion sovereign debt unwind that has been underway in the developed world since 2008 and is now accelerating in ways that the mortgage renewal shock is making visible in Canada right now. The prepared do not panic. They do not act in fear. They act in clarity. They look at what the mathematics is telling them. 170% household debt to income, a synchronized renewal shock hitting the most leveraged cohort of borrowers in Canadian history, a consumer economy built on the scaffolding of housing wealth that is now being tested for the first time. And they make decisions that reflect that clarity. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic gesture, but deliberately, systematically, with the understanding that the time for comfortable assumptions has passed and the time for honest reckoning is here. The question is not whether Canada's housing debt architecture is under structural strain. The data has already answered that. The question is not whether the mortgage renewal wave will create household financial pressure across this country. The mathematics has already answered that. The only question that remains unanswered, and it is the only question that actually matters for you personally, is whether you will be among those who recognize the fault line before it opened fully, or among those who will look back and recall with painful clarity the moment when the evidence was plain, the window was open, and the choice was still yours to make. History favors the prepared, friends, and the window for preparation is closing.